F. Bruce, in his book, The Defense of the Gospel in the New Testament, argues that in the New Testament there are two primary arguments for our faith. One is the evidence for the life, death, and resurrection for Yeshua, the resurrection especially, so historical evidence. And the other is that Yeshua fulfilled prophecy, that is, the predictions of who the Messiah would be and what he would do. I'm Daniel Juster, and I'm coming to you from the Jerusalem area in our course in Apologetics, Evidence for What We Believe, and I am making this presentation to you on the evidence for fulfilled prophecy, and I hope it's edifying and helpful to you. At the time of the New Testament, the Jewish people that believed in the prophets, and not all sects of the Jewish people did, the Sadducees didn't, but the Pharisees and Essenes did, believed that the Bible talked about the coming of the Messiah. They had an understanding that Israel would be delivered from the oppression of foreigners, in this case the Romans, and that they would throw off the yoke of the Romans, and that they would become a light to the world, and the nations would come to the knowledge of God. Of course, you can read about that in the book of Isaiah. It's very clear there, and this is also taught in Joel and Zechariah, and we could go on and on. Many of the other prophets have this understanding of the ultimate deliverance of Israel and their role in bringing the nations of the world to redemption. But this will take place under a leader, the leader who is a descendant of King David. We call him David's greater son, and that David's greater son will lead Israel to this victory. And our people in the first century were looking for that personage that would lead them to that victory. Some of them were looking for a military leader, in part. The Davidic king would be the military leader first, who would throw off the Romans. And you can see a lot of the background for understanding some aspects of the Gospels in terms of Jewish people, zealots, looking for that kind of a Messiah. But of course, Yeshua didn't do that. And when we come to the pages of the Gospels, we come to understand that Yeshua is fulfilling prophecy, but in a way sometimes it wasn't completely perceived. Yes, he fulfills some of the predictions exactly that were true. He is a child of Miriam, not Joseph, because the Bible teaches the virgin birth, but he is a descendant through Miriam of King David, and a descendant by adoption of Joseph going back to King David. So he is legitimately a claimant to the throne of Israel. And those genealogies are an important part of the prophetic record about who Yeshua is. On the other hand, though Yeshua is born in Bethlehem as prophesied in Micah, his ministry takes on a different character than what was expected of the Messiah. He becomes more like Moses, the great teacher of Israel, and a prophet, and I guess it was thought at that time by his followers, it seems to be that's what they were thinking, well, eventually we're going to get past this period, and he's going to lead us in the military victory to overthrow the Romans and take over and establish his rule in Jerusalem. But we want to look at some of the prophetic scriptures about him today, and just to note that his fulfillment of prophecy is broader than just doing the predictions about the Messiah, although that's very important. Doing the predictions is a clear evidence for what we believe and why we believe it. But he also fills up the meaning of Israel's history. And sometimes when the Gospels say this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophets, it means he is reduplicating in his person the history of Israel. So just as Israel went down to Egypt to be preserved, so the Messiah went down to Egypt to be preserved. Just as Israel was in the wilderness for 40 years, so the Messiah is in the wilderness tested by the devil for 40 years, as Israel was tested during those 40 years. Just as Israel went through the waters of the Red Sea in their deliverance, so Yeshua, in identification with Israel, would go through those waters. And a lot of the fulfillment passages we read are convincing to people because they would have expected this kind of corporate identification of Yeshua with Messiah. So they saw a predictive element in it, though for Western scientifically minded people they might not see it to the same extent. But I want to talk about some of the passages that are really predictive. For example, in Micah 5:2 it says, "But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the tribes of Israel, from you shall he be born who is to be the ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been of old." And the fact that the Messiah is born in Bethlehem, and that we read in the Gospel of Luke of Herod's and Matthew of Herod's retaliation against the Messiah, because he was afraid of another king being born that would have competition and perhaps supplant the Herodian throne. These things are very historically real and impacting. So he is born in Bethlehem, and then he enters into a miraculous life, but then especially the fulfillment of prophecy takes place toward the end of his life in terms of the passion. In Zechariah chapter 9:9, we read that the Messiah, the King, the Anointed One, comes to you lowly and riding upon a colt, on a donkey. And this was a very strong prophecy of how the Messiah would come into Jerusalem humbly, riding on a colt, not coming into Jerusalem as the conquering king. So Zechariah 9:9 is a hint that the idea of the Messiah as throwing off the Romans and just taking over is not the only strand of Messianic prophecy that there is, but there's another thrust of Messianic prophecy about this humble Messiah who we're going to find lays down his life for others. Quite a different kind of a theme. I want to turn in the Bible to Isaiah chapter 42, and we're going to look at some of the servant songs. These are called the servant songs of Isaiah, and what it says about the Messiah and how they fit Yeshua, and they don't fit the conquering king image, although there are those images of the Messiah as well. So in Isaiah chapter 42 we read, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one." Now in the Targums, which are the first century interpretations by the rabbis of Yeshua, it actually says, where it says my servant, they add the words the Messiah. And this is kind of really important. So this figure was understood to be the Messiah, at least in a significant sector of Judaism. It says, "I have put my spirit on him, he will bring forth justice to the nations." Now that's the Messianic role for sure. But then it says, "He will not cry out or raise his voice or make his voice heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. He will faithfully bring forth justice." Now, this compassion of being gentle to those who are hurting, which is what these two images are of the smoldering wick and the bruised reed. "He will not be disheartened nor crushed till he establishes justice on the earth, and the islands will wait for his Torah. Thus says Adonai, who created the heavens and the earth and stretched them out and spread out the earth, and what comes from it, who gives breath to the peoples on it, and the spirit to those who walk in it. I, Adonai, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and give you a covenant to the people, a light to the nation, by opening blind eyes, bringing prisoners out of dark dungeons, and those sitting in darkness out of the prison home." This builds, as we come to Isaiah chapter 49, to a more and more humble Messiah figure. And more the passages fit Yeshua. God says it in verse 6, "Is it too trifling a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel? So I will give you as a light to the nations, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth." That's Israel's role, but it's also the role of Israel's corporate representative, the Messiah. "Thus says Adonai, the Redeemer of Israel, their Holy One, to the one despised, to the one the nation abhors. Wow, how can that be said of the Messiah? That's anticipating Isaiah chapter 53. But then kings will see and arise, and princes will bow down. And this has happened because of Adonai, who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel. Isaiah chapter 50, also speaking of this servant. These amazing passages. Verse 5 of chapter 50, Adonai Elohim has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious, nor did I turn back. I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those pulling out my beard. I did not hide my face from humiliation and spitting. For Adonai Elohim will help me, therefore I have not been disgraced, therefore I will set my face like flint. And no, I will not be ashamed. The one who vindicates me is near. So here we have the same idea of suffering, being rejected, pulling out his beard. Humiliation and suffering comes to Israel, but comes to Israel's Messiah. And then in Isaiah chapter 53, the most poignant and clear passage that cannot be of the nation of Israel, because he suffers for Israel as a sacrifice for Israel. And once again, this passage perfectly fits Yeshua. Who has believed our report? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him as a tender shoot and as a root out of dry ground. He had no form or comeliness that we should look at him, nor beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, but we esteemed him stricken, struck by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced because of our transgressions, crushed because of our iniquities. The chastisement of our shalom was upon him, and by his stripes we have been healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to slaughter, a sheep before his shearers is dumb. He did not open his mouth. And then we will skip. Verse 10, yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He caused him to suffer and makes his soul a guilt offering. But he will see his offspring. He will prolong his days. And there we see the clear hint of the resurrection. The will of Adonai will succeed by his hand. And as a result of his anguish of soul, he will see it and be satisfied. And by his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will make many righteous, for he will bear their iniquities. Wow, what a prediction is this chapter 53. But it's not the only one we have that is so amazing. Daniel chapter 9. And, if you want more than this, you have to buy the book, Biblical Worldview and Apologetic, or take the course, which is the full course, which can be yours in addition to these shorter presentations. But in the book of Daniel, I want to read this remarkable passage to you where it says, as Daniel's praying, 70 weeks are decreed, and this is usually understood as 70 weeks of years or 490 years. Daniel's prophesying during the days of the Persian Empire, concerning your people and your holy city, to put an end to transgression, to bring an end to sin, to atone for iniquity. Look at that. To put an end to transgression, to bring sin to an end, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy. The end of scriptural prophecy, as authoritative and canonical, ended when this prophecy was fulfilled. From the decree to restore and build Jerusalem until the Messiah, or the anointed, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, the total 483 years. The temple will be rebuilt with plaza and moat, but it will be times of distress. And then after the 62 weeks, that is 62 further weeks after the 7, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. Wow. Then the people of the prince who is to come, this is the second temple, this is Titus, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end will come as a flood until the end of war is decreed. There will be destruction. So here we read about the exact timing of the Messiah before the destruction of the second temple. And this has convinced many people of the truth that Yeshua had to be the Messiah, because it fits the coming in the first century before the destruction of the second temple. But you know, the Messiah will come again, and there are prophecies about the day in which we live. Isaiah chapter 35 speaks about the Jewish people returning to the land and the desert blossoming as a rose. But the book of Ezekiel speaks about our people coming back to the land before we have turned to the Lord and have had the change of heart, which we interpreted as the change of heart concerning him. So fulfilled prophecy is still taking place today. In Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 24, God says of Israel, we're living this today, I will take you from the nations and gather you out of all the countries and bring you back to your own land. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean from all your uncleanliness and from all your idols. Moreover, I will give you a new heart. I will put a new spirit within you, and I will remove the stony heart from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my Ruach spirit within you, and I will cause you to walk in my laws, so that you will keep my rulings and do them. Then you will live in the land I gave to your fathers. You will be my people, and I will be your God. We are living in the day of the beginning of the fulfillment of this prophecy. We've come back to the land, and God is going to give us this new heart. And so prophecy will yet be fulfilled, and we will see the return of our Messiah. God bless you, and I hope that this time talking just about a very few prophecies is helpful. There are so many more that we speak about in our book, The Biblical Worldview, an Apologetic.